find questions in the chat. I'll do that later.
Actually, Louis, since you're going to be starting, maybe we should swap places for this.
I'm just going to stop right here.
Okay, all right.
Folks, hello. Welcome in this weather to our wonderful home here. I'm Louis Chidisoki, professor of English and director of studies, or rather, African American and Black diaspora studies program. So I welcome you all to this wonderful conversation and celebration of our dear colleague. Come on in, folks, this room. Dear colleague and friend Takeo Rivera, whose eagerly anticipated book has now been published, Model Minority Masochism, Performing the Cultural Politics of Asian American Masculinity. Dr. Rivera is assistant professor of English here at BU, where he's also core faculty in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and affiliated faculty in our program, as well as American and Indian studies. He is a former faculty fellow at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center, and a playwright whose work has been staged and read in New York City, Boston, San Francisco Bay Area, and Los Angeles. Articles of his have been published in such journals as Amerasia, Performance Research, and ASAP Journal, as well as the Rutledge Companion to Asian American Media Anthology. A publicly engaged scholar, Rivera has been interviewed in Al Jazeera, The Atlantic, Financial Times, Wired, and others. And when I say publicly engaged, it means that the brother looks good in a blazer. Prior to his PhD, Rivera worked as a rape crisis advocate, counselor, and educator in San Jose, California. Also share some of that breathing and warmth with Diane and Hikaru, the family of our guest. Our interlocutor tonight is another great reason to be at Boston University, Dr. Carrie Preston, who is the Arvind and Chandan Mandel Pilachan Professor and Director of Pilachan Honors College, Professor of English and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the founding co-director of the Initiative on Forced Displacement at Boston University. She's the author of a number of notable and award-winning books and essays on modernism, performance, and critical race, gender, and studies. I'm going to now cede the floor, the virtual hybrid floor, to Dr. Preston and Takeo Rivera.
It is such a pleasure to be here to speak with Takeo Rivera and to comment on his absolutely brilliant book. Thanks to all of you who are present in this space. Thanks to those of you joining us on Zoom. Feel free at any point to throw questions into the chat, my fellow Zoomers, and I will bring them to Takeo, and in the room, of course, formulate your questions and you can ask them directly. I thought I would start by offering a paltry response and summary to this really remarkable book. Takeo Rivera's Model Minority Masochism, Performing the Cultural Politics of Asian American Masculinity, is a masterful and provocative book that provides a new theory of Asian American subject formation, one that centers the masochistic lure produced in part by the model minority myth. Notice that I said a new theory of Asian American subject formation, rather than a theory of the Asian American subject, a scholarly formation that Takeo carefully critiques as essentialist and reductive. He basically takes that idea to task. Takeo addresses the challenging question of how to imagine an Asian American politics and studies that maintains a radical, anti-imperial, anti-racist critique without denying the fact that Asian Americans also benefit from, and in some cases promote, and in other cases enjoy or promote and enjoy the idea of model minoritarianism. Takeo's provocative answer is rooted in his theory of model minority masochism, a formulation that is sure to be cited regularly after the publication of the book. You're going to see it everywhere. Takeo defines Model minority masochism is the affective response and cultural politics that best clarifies how model minority racialization incorporates pleasure and pain, pleasure from pain, typically through an embrace of subordination and moralism. Rather than arguing against the framework of the model minority that has dominated so much thinking on Asian American identities, he seeks to recognize the tremendous influence of the model minority as a racial and class-based position shot through with anti-Blackness, an ideology that in fact seeks to expand racial capitalism. Takeo points out the model minority is constructed as much in economic and gender terms as in racial ones, as the minority becomes the model through bourgeois success and uplift, historically associated with masculinities that are complicated by Orientalism and techno-Orientalism. He brilliantly foregrounds the model as a form of mimicry, play, doubling, and other performances, often deadly performances. To that point, model minority masochism opens with two gut-wrenching stories of men who, according to Takeo, become Asian American through being killed. The 1982 murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit, Michigan by Ronald Evans and Michelle Nitz, two disgruntled white auto workers who connected the Chinese American Vincent Chin with Japanese competition in the auto industry. 31 years later, 18-year-old Michael Dang was killed in a fraternity ritual called the Glass Ceiling as he sought to join Pi Delta Psi, an Asian American fraternity that forced pledges to experience hazing as racial suffering. Pi Delta Psi sought to educate fraternity brothers in the history of Asian American exclusion and racism, such as that represented by the murder of Vincent Chin, and set the tuition for their course on Asian American masculinities violently high. The book proceeds through genres as diverse as theater, literature, video games, film, and comic books. Takeo explores the Asian American subject formation in all its paradoxical, excessive, yet brutally regulated, racialized, and gendered pleasures and pains. His methodologies are also diverse: psychoanalysis, queer, Marxist, and technocultural theories, post-structuralism, and more, although, as he points out, these can roughly be included under the hybrid umbrellas of performance studies and queer color critique. One of the things that Takeo points out to me is how very young Asian American studies is. He dates its literary critical emergence to Elaine Kim's 1982 Asian American Literature, an Introduction to the Writings and Their Social Context. This is also the year of the murder of Vincent Chin, which Takeo analyzes in chapter 1 through the court theatrics and the 1988 film Who Killed Vincent Chin. Then in chapter 2, he takes up two staged performances that contend with the murder: Ping Chong's 1995 play Chinoiserie, and Philip Kangotanda's and Frank Wu's trial reenactment at UC Hastings in 2013. Chapter 3 goes on to consider Gotanda's plays After the War of 2007 and I Dream of Chang and Eng, 2011. Chapter 4 turns to the 2006-2007 run of Marvel Comics' Incredible Hulk, penned by Korean-American writer and filmmaker Greg Pak. Turning then to contemporary alternative literature, Takeo offers brilliant readings of Tao Lin's semi-autobiographical novel Taipei of 2013, and Tan Lin's fictional memoir Insomnia and the Ant of 2011. Texts that conceptualize Asianness as affective flatness, accessible, Takeo argues, through technological mediation. Finally, in chapter 6, Takeo presents what he calls a critical plane of the 2011 cyberpunk video game Deus Ex, Human Revolution DXHR by Eidos Montreal. It's an incredible tour de force through fascinating genres, and I encourage you to spend a lot of time with these readings and these works, and with Takeo's brilliant, interesting, engaging prose. His skill as a creative writer is often tremendously evident in these chapters. And of course, this book could not be more relevant at a moment when hate crimes against Asian Americans are on the rise again, when former President Donald Trump, shepherded into office by white resentment, gleefully referred to COVID-19 as the Chung flu, and that anti-Black racial wedge that Takeo analyzes is still wedging away and might drive itself into students for fair admissions versus Harvard, a case the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this session. I want to start with a question for you, Takeo, that is about this moment and you in this moment, if that's okay. You are so present in this book. What we've talked about, what I've called an autoethnographic drive in your project. It's present throughout. This autoethnographic drive then reaches a seeming apotheosis in chapter 6, where you write, I operate from an understanding of the game as a realm of open signification. This is the chapter on the video game, or where video games are most central. As the game as a realm of open signification, analyzing not just the content and form of the object in question, the game itself, but the practice of playing from the perspective of an Asian American male-identified subject, that is, myself. It's so brave and a critical work. But I said that it's a seeming apotheosis of the autoethnographic, because then in the coda, which was totally new to me, the coda includes a spoken word poem, Model Minority, that you wrote in 2005 as a 19-year-old college freshman. You then offer a history of your own coming of age, which is also a coming to this project. You describe seeing yourself in Michael Dang, the fraternity pledge, and the fraternity brothers who tortured him. You analyze Andrew Yang's campaign for the US presidency so brilliantly, and the April 2020 op-ed, encouraging Asian Americans to use their tech brilliance to come up with the cure for COVID-19. So I'm just wondering, can you talk a bit about the autoethnographic impulse in this book? I know it has a history in the drafts of the book that I've had the privilege of looking at it. And I feel it moved to another level in this final manuscript. So could you talk about, I guess, the emergence of this impulse, where it took you and maybe what you were hoping to do with it?
Oh, wow. Well, first, before I answer that question, I just want to thank you so much for that really quite overwhelming, beautiful description of the book. I'm really kind of a lost for words for everything you just said, Carrie. Thank you so much, and you've been such a wonderful and inspiring mentor to me this entire time here at BU. Thank you also to Louis and to Deirdre and Portia for making this event happen as well. I just want to thank you all, immensely to begin with. But to your question, I think what's interesting about the process of writing it, especially as it moved from dissertation to book, was it became increasingly clear to me that that the autoethnographic impulse was something that I was always drawing from the beginning. Even if it wasn't necessarily explicit in the text, it was always kind of a libidinal force that motivated how I analyzed everything that was going on in this book. A lot of times my pursuit of very theoretical frameworks was really to just kind of validate that which my intuition was always sort of getting at. So as I revised the dissertation into a book, it became, I just realized there's no one really looking over my shoulder anymore. I don't have a dissertation committee anymore, so I might as well just do it. So I might as well just be open and explicit about all my different positions. And I don't know if you necessarily saw in earlier drafts the kind of personal reflections that I was making driving through Detroit, for example, as listening to Tupac come on as I'm driving to Vincent's gravesite, for example. And I realized I might as well deploy these multiple voices that I have cultivated in my various writing practices. Might as well put it into the book, because why not, I guess. But it is true that in many respects, this book does represent a culmination of thinking that I've been doing well before grad school. Even, I mean, I would say all the way back to undergraduate. I would say that freshman year spoken word poem, in many respects, is the very start of this book to begin with. And I had to evolve a lot as a person from that freshman year version of me, younger than a lot of you are here today. But the question remains. The question remains, just like how to contend with this notion of the model minority and how it affects how we come into our racial becoming. Does that make sense? Kind of. Yeah.
So just to follow up on that line of thinking a little bit, what's it like to be so present in this book? Do you feel that it is a kind of autobiography of you?
I think that there's something very masochistic about it. I mean, to be frank, I think that the method the object is the method as well, right? The more that I'm in the book, the more I'm subject to critique, and the more that people dislike the book, the more I'm like, yeah, just like lay it on me even more and more and more, right? The stakes get, I'm laying myself bare in many respects here. And I think that it's important, even though there are parts of the book that are very, very, very dense, very, very theoretical, I did feel that it was important to connect with the reader, right? And I think with in academic writing, it's very easy to forget that, just because we have tenure to get, and we have our own disciplinary norms. We have the kinds of people that we're imagining we're trying to impress. But I still wanted to write in a way that was not always consistently accessible, but at the very least, some form of compelling, I suppose. And in order to do that, I mean, I was trained as a writer. So, just a bit of background, I was trained as a writer mostly through two activities, which was as a slam poet. I was a slam poet for 4 years. And I trained as a playwright under Rivera. So it was kind of one of the founders of 1981 of color feminism. And both of those modes taught me to speak from a confessional mode. And if people have taken my contemporary drama course, confession is something that I'm sort of preoccupied with all the time. I'm thinking about questions of social change and the power of testimonial, and whether or not it's whether there are sort of potential issues with testimonial, whether problematic with testimonial, but it was nevertheless my starting. It was nevertheless my starting point epistemologically to try to figure out how to solve any of the problems that I'm confronting, because through that vulnerability, I always felt that it was more possible for a message to land. That makes sense.
In the messages that you're trying to land, there's obviously a message about the model minority. And I was thinking about it sort of in two ways that are maybe not divergent, but I can imagine a framing of this book that it's an intervention in theories and critiques of model minoritarianism. But I was also thinking about a framing that was sort of more like a ambivalent redeployment of model minoritarianism. And maybe both can happen, but I wonder, in a sense, if one of those speaks more to you in terms of how you would like your book to be presented to the world, but also maybe just in sort of more layman's terms, what should happen to this idea of the model minority? Where do you want it to go? Obviously, Andrew Yang wasn't the direction you were looking for. It's such a brilliant part at the end of the book. But like, what is its future as a concept, as an idea?
That's a great question. That's such a wonderful question. I think that, at the end of the day, let me say what I don't want it to be. What I don't want it to be is a clear prescription for how to solve the contradictions of Asian American cultural thought. I'm not trying to, I think there are a lot of works in ethnic studies that sort of lay out, okay, this is the good thing that we're all supposed to be following. This is what this book is absolutely not doing that. Very explicit. And it is indeed ambivalent. I like to tell the story of how I did approach a very, very prominent, recently profiled editor of a major press pitching this book. And you know, he asked me, so what is model minority masochism? Is it good or bad? Is it good or bad? Is it, yeah, what's your position? And you know, he got me real nervous, and I was like, no, I don't know. And then he said, is the answer going to be it's complicated? And I'm like, yes. He was like, then I don't want the book. So you know, I was rejected on the spot because I couldn't land a position, but I still haven't landed a position. I think but one thing that I do want to, so, you know, one basic sort of part of the argument of the book is that Asian Americans within this pan-ethnic framework developed one of two masochistic relationships to the model minority. That is, one, they may choose to embrace the model minority as a concept, even take pleasure from it, you know, find themselves as willing supporters of the status quo of racial capitalism, or they punish themselves for having been interpolated, that they viciously reject the model minority, but also sort of inflict a lot of shame to themselves for having been in a structural position that has been anti-Black and so forth, right? So, but both of these are masochistic positions in different ways. One is sort of in a pleasurable standpoint, and the other is in a punishment standpoint. And I guess one thing I do want to say is that one of these masochisms, I would argue cautiously, is better than the other. That I do think that there is, in fact, a value to the self-punishing masochism to a certain extent. But when it comes down to it, it's not entirely clear if this is something that we can escape, I suppose. Right? This is something that we have this sort of ongoing dialectic between these two positions of being model minority, and you see these different texts that we see in this book contending with that, right? And also that the model minority does get filtered through gender, right? It does get filtered through gender. That many of the anxieties about being model minority find themselves attached to anxieties around masculinity, anxieties around being strong and whole and so forth, right? And I think if I were to write a sequel to this book, I don't know if I would, but if there were to be a sequel to this book, it would have to be from the position of feminine. It would have to be from the position of how do we analyze the feminine attachments to model minoritarian. But I guess to finally answer your question, Carrie, I think ultimately it's about having a rubric to understand this paradigm. And I think there's one way that within Asian, I think there's also a big gap between Asian American Studies scholarship and what it's prescribing and what it wants to see from an Asian American community, as radical, as progressive, and so forth. And I think a majority of Asian Americans who are not those things, a majority of Asian Americans who are actually perfectly fine with attaching themselves to a model minority ideology. And we have to sort of incorporate, not necessarily incorporate that into a politics, but at least incorporate into our analysis of the structural position. And I think that is what this book is kind of trying to do. How do we preserve a sort of a radical Asian American politics, while at the same time keeping in mind that this is what our community really looks like, right? So I think that's kind of what I'm doing.
Awesome. You've broached this topic about Asian American studies, and the university is very much present in the background of your book. Certainly starting with the death of Michael Dang, also your own undergraduate and graduate then writings present in the book. And we're at BU, where Asian American Studies is, well, I should let you qualify it, I was going to say, in its infancy. But what should this field, this field of study and the university, maybe specifically BU, what approach should BU take to Asian American studies?
Well, that is an amazing question. Well, first of all, we need Asian American Studies, period, right? I think that's the first step. But
so maybe infancy isn't the right.
Yeah, I mean, what's great is that the university is taking steps, and I really appreciate those things. And we have, you know, we have really African American Studies as one of the major allies for supporting the efforts of Asian American Studies. But what should it look like here at BU, especially if you're starting out and we can kind of build the canvas however we want? I think that we want to have an Asian American Studies that is from the beginning intersectional, that is from the beginning incorporating modes of queer analysis, that at the beginning, and in many respects also honors the legacy of an original Asian American Studies that was anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and so forth. And I think what's really important to understand is that Asian American as a term of pan-ethnicity, right? Before it was Oriental, but after Oriental, Asian American really came to be born with Asian American Studies as a field of study in the late 60s and early 70s to signify a pan-ethnic alliance against racism and imperialism. It was happening in the context of the Civil Rights Movement. It was happening in the context of the Vietnam War. That kind of original radicality, and also, and if we want to be really, really radical, the Third World Liberation Front strikes that came to produce Asian American Studies to begin with wanted to redesign the entire university altogether and to reshape what it meant to produce scholarship, reshape what it meant to have a different kind of relationship between the community and the institution. And for things like community work to be counted towards tenure, right? For community service to really count as part of the learning beyond, I think in many ways beyond what contemporary service learning projects usually look like, right? So Asian American Studies has always been, I mean, not always, but from the get-go was very, very radical. And then gradually became more and more and more institutionalized, which is not completely bad, because I do think the intellectual rigor of it strengthened over the decades. But I think it's important that we develop a new Asian American Studies here, that it combines the best of the old and the new, right? That we are able to get past the incompleteness of a race-only politics that oftentimes found itself dominating Asian American Studies in that early period. That we incorporate queer and queer voices, for example, as central to thinking through what it means to be Asian American. But at the same time, remembering that the early forms of Asian American Studies could imagine a different way of organizing the university altogether, which is really quite rare. Now, of course, would an Asian American Studies program at BU do that? Hard to say, but it's something to aspire to at the very least.
That's great. We will aspire with you, Takeo. So I'll ask one more question, and then there's a fantastic question in the chat, and I hope more will come in, and I hope in the audience there in the room, you will also have questions. One of the ways that this book challenged me, Takeo, is that I realized how much I associated the pleasures of femininity with masochism, and had not, through certainly my own limited vision, associated the pleasures of masculinity with masochism. And so I wonder if you could comment on that. You've already tantalizingly suggested that the next book would be about the relationships between Asian American model minority identities and femininity or women's relationship to those ideas. But I guess the crux of my question is, in one direction, is gender just masochistic? Or is there something more specific about masculinity that you're seeking to teach us? Masculinity more generally, I guess.
So I think in some respects, this book is saying less about masculinity than it is about the model minority. But I guess in a lot of ways, I mean, if you really want a really, really good treatise on masculinity, you should check out Saida Grundy's new book.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I will defer to her. But I think that I first of all, I love what you're saying about the idea of gender itself being masochistic. I think there's absolutely something there. That, you know, even if we think about Lauren Berlant's concept of cruel optimism, right? That gender absolutely as a mode of social organization and as an identity can itself be a cruel optimism in and of itself. That we find both masculinity and femininity. Right? But I would say that the way that different authors think through masochism does differ by gender. And I think that because the fact, I mean, in many respects, my choice to stick to masculinity was, I should point out, strongly suggested by my dissertation committee that consisted entirely of people who are not men. It was 4 women and a non-binary person, and all of them were saying, like, do masculinity. So I was like, that's interesting. Okay. And they actually advised me to cut out some of the chapters that dealt more with women's stuff. I was like, okay, if you say so. So that was just kind of a funny irony. But I think that, but I do think that there's something about, I guess I think to like Bersani, for example, who recently passed away. And the way that bottoming could actually be a mode of hypermasculinity, because you're sort of showing how much pain you can take, right? Or how much you can be penetrated and so forth, right? And that there's something very that there's a toxic masculinity that finds itself worming its way into there. And I think that a lot of my intellectual forebears on the subject were also focused on masculinity, such as like Gwen Tan Huang, for example. So I think that in many respects, and I also think that masochism in relationship to masculinity is like slightly more, there's something slightly more subversive and counterintuitive. I think, as you just said, Carrie, right? Like you sort of traditionally associate femininity with, or masochism with the feminine position, you know, because of heteronormative, socialization. But there is, but when we associate masculinity with masochism, there's something kind of pathological there, and I mean pathological not in a bad way, but in a way that produces something sort of generative, counterintuitive, and weird. And that's kind of always why I gravitate towards intellectual. So I think that's why I ended up being really focused on masculinity, besides the fact that my dissertation committee is sort of.
That's fascinating. The impact of those dissertation committees.
Yeah. So thank you very much.
So I have a great question here from Professor Patterson. She writes, you have spoken eloquently about the importance of autoethnography and how being a creative writer was a starting point of this project. Could you say something about how your insights in the book lay a foundation for your labor as a teacher, activist, and public-facing intellectual, especially in response to recent events such as the massacre of Asian American women in Atlanta, Georgia, in the spring of 2021?
Oh, yeah. Okay, that's a great question. Thank you, Anita. Well, certainly as a teacher, well, I think in a lot of ways, in respect to teaching, it actually goes kind of the other direction for me. That is to say, when you're in my classes, I'm always reminded of why I do it. And that just kind of like actually helps my writing a lot, just like being in an active intellectual space with all of you. And that just like gives me so much inspiration to just put words onto the page. And you know, it teaches me that there's actually a community of people who care about these same questions as I do. So I think in a lot of ways, from a teaching standpoint, I think the teaching helps the writing in some ways more than the writing helps the teaching, if I'm being honest. And in terms of the public facing media appearances, and yeah, because yeah, last year it was a lot. Getting, you know, after the massacre in Atlanta happened, like basically anyone who did Asian American studies was bombarded with media requests everywhere. Right, and just like how every Black studies person is bombarded after the latest horrible murder by police, right? And it's like, but I think that in a lot of ways, you know, the autoethnographic mode of writing for myself, it did help me figure out how to communicate these things in a way that was digestible to a larger audience. So I wasn't necessarily, even though I can speak very theoretically when I feel like it, I don't feel like it right now because I'm too sleep deprived, but it allowed me to be able to relate things to people's experiences rather quickly because I could kind of empathize myself. I think what's kind of interesting is like my experience as a playwright was really helpful across the board, whether it was as a scholar, as a teacher, or as back when I was doing the crisis work, because it allowed me to understand character motivation. It allowed me to understand what made people, what people wanted. And understanding that oftentimes was my starting place when I was unpacking this analytically, creatively. That makes sense.
If there are questions in the room, just raise your hand.
Okay. So I'm thinking a lot about the kind of primary dialectic that you're working with now, Masochism as embracing the wrong or as punishment for having already finished within that model. And at the same time, what the experience of college activism is. And so I'm wondering if there's a kind of third space where the pleasure or masochism comes through actively rebuffing that model minority interpolation, because so much college activism revolves around or is centered on the process of becoming illegible to the university in the ways that they expect you to, right?
Yeah.
Like gender-based organizing experience. So I apologize if that's a little bit away from the book, but I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. Like, is there a space for pleasure in the act of rebuffing entire?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, and I think, but you know, that's such a great question, Jenna. And I think that you've also kind of like hit the nail on the head about the limits of masculinity. Because I think within a masculine framework, certainly a hetero-masculine, that if there's pleasure.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. Can you rephrase the question? For
Okay,
us?
sorry, so Jenna was just asking basically whether or not there's a third space outside this dialect, and thinking through maybe a form of pleasure that rebuffs these model minority hails as a word, right? Both within and including outside of an Asian American context. And basically, my answer to that is yes. And part of the reason why that's such an important question is because it forces us to imagine outside heteromasculinity. Because I think within the framework of heteromasculinity, in order for it to be noble, and it must not be pleasure. Right? So you know, I'm always sort of, sometimes I'm skeptical of outsides of the discourse that surrounds us or whatever, but that may actually be genuinely outside that in a way that could be very revolutionary. So I think that's that's a really good question. Also, Jenna's, I think, probably the only other person who read the entire book. That's just because Jenna did my copy edit. So, you family. You did a great job. Hi, Mo.
Yeah, congratulations. I'll talk loudly, hopefully, so people can hear me on Zoom. This was spurred by Terry's, remark that you're making yourself vulnerable and a little bit professional. Just wondering about reactions that you've had thus far to the work, and maybe reactions that you're anticipating, because I can see this kind of pissing off everybody.
Yeah.
And are you airing dirty laundry in public? And how does it, what sort of reactions are you thinking about?
So the book just came out last week. Oh, so if you couldn't, did everyone hear? So if you couldn't hear, Professor Mobley was asking if given the subject matter and the way I'm putting myself out there, what kind of reactions have I gotten or are anticipating? Because they'll probably piss everyone off. So yeah, the book just came out last week, so I don't have a whole lot of reactions so far. The blurb on the back says the book is often disturbing.
You know what folks are saying.
Yeah, I know. So honestly, I actually been having a lot of anxiety about this book for, ever since I got the contract. Ever since I got the book contract, I've been like, oh God, I'm putting a target on my back. I also am critical of some of the most heroic activists of Asian American activists in the 1980s, who are genuinely heroic, who I actually absolutely admire, but I am critical of them. So I've been actually sweating bullets about this book this whole time, and I'm very, but at the same time, I feel like if I didn't write it in that way, I might be selling myself short, I guess, so I might get roundly canceled by someone, but maybe it's worth it.
Well, that's why FM has got your back, because we're becoming increasingly the program in dirty secrets. You ain't alone.
I appreciate that, Lewis. But yeah, that definitely is the subject for therapy.
Any questions in the chat, Karen?
Yes, I have a great question from our brilliant former student, now graduate student at Indiana, Nicole Rizzo, saying, I can't wait to read your monograph. Lots of congratulations here in the chat, of course. Nicole is asking, I was wondering if you could speak to or about how your monograph is in conversation with, or how it contrasts with Munoz's methodological approach of disidentification.
Good question. I think I briefly mentioned Munoz here. I guess the thing is about Munoz, and I've been going back and forth with Munoz, and Munoz is someone who is very, very revered within queer color theory. I teach Munoz in like every queer course that I teach, but I've been growing increasingly skeptical of some of Munoz's formulations here and there. which again is a kind of a cancelable position for me to take. But I think this identification, although very, very useful and very, very descriptive, it's a little different. It's a little different from this, because I guess this identification is still kind of noble, right? This identification still gives us a positive way of contending with power that is not resistance. Here, I'm trying to avoid being positive or negative altogether. I suppose that's the, I don't really see any major utopian potential in either side of the masochism equation, I guess. I see there's more hope on one side of it. That's not quite the same as saying it's a solution. Right? I think that's what I was saying earlier in terms of it not being prescriptive. I think this identification is actually kind of a prescriptive formulation in some respects. And it's certainly not utopian, which is in reference to utopia.
This is not so much of a question as a plea for further conversation beyond this event. The term model minority is really interesting to me because I've encountered it less in the discussions about Asian Americans and more in my own work in descriptions of African immigrants and Jamaican and Caribbean immigrants who are seen as Black model minorities.
Absolutely, yes.
And attempting to make sense of how they relate to it psychoanalytically. Well, psychoanalysis has never been my strong suit, but it's something worth thinking about. That's one of the reasons I look forward to reading this. But what's really interesting is that the Harvard case.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
One of the interesting things about Harvard and this case about to go to the Supreme Court is that behind the conversation are African immigrants and their children, who are the largest number of Black students at Harvard, right? Who have a problematic relationship to the case because so many of them have had access to Harvard because of their qualifications. Absolutely.
Right, yeah.
But also
coded as Black
African American affirmative action, which we know in the 90s, Henry Louis Gates, Lanny Guinier, and so many prominent Black leaders argued should not go to African immigrants and Caribbean immigrants, right, which created a whole bunch of problems. I'm only bringing this up because behind the Asian American Harvard thing, there's this lurking presence, not to stereotype Black people as lurking presences, of the African and Black immigrant population who have a stake in this argument in a very interesting way. I'm looking for more conversation about that.
Okay, that's amazing. But actually, I don't know what is the position of most African immigrant and Caribbean students with respect to this case. Yeah.
It's complicated simply because it depends on when they arrived.
Wow. Interesting. Yeah.
If they've been here for a generation or so, they tend to be more on the African American side. If they've just arrived or are consider home West Africa or whatever, they tend to be more on the other side.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
As I said, there's no question there. I'm just saying that this conversation is a broader one that includes new waves of Blacknesses in it.
That's absolutely right. Now that said, I do mention in the intro very briefly that the model minority discourse has applied to other non-Asian minorities,
Yes.
such as white gay people and of course African immigrants, right? But I think that Asian Americans have kind of a unique, how do you say it? Inextricability to the model minority, right? There's a way that, like, even if an event about Asian Americans has nothing to do with the model minority is going to come up in conversation somehow, which is annoying. Whereas it's not necessarily true for Black people.
Right? But I would say though that you're absolutely right. But it's interesting that for a Black minority to compare themselves to Asian American model minority as a way of not coding as the African American minority fits into your scheme.
Oh, that's absolutely right. No, you're right. It's also
it makes Blackness something else, some race, something else. So I don't know what it is yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is. I mean, and if I'm going to talk about like my own college experience, what's kind of interesting is when I really think about this, is just like straight up anecdotal. The highest achievers in my circles were not the Asian Americans. It was always the African Americans.
Statistically, they are.
Like they're always the ones who I looked up to the most in terms of like, I wish I could be as talented as those individually, right? It's kind of interesting, like how there's still this perception that's like Asian whiz kids for everything, but that's not really the case. Like, but
It's the nerdy Nigeria.
yeah, exactly. Nerdy Nigeria. That's where all the
Where the sci-fi is coming from.
yeah, that's true. But yeah.
Like I said, it's a plea for it's more conversation, because this is so helpful to thinking about that, because that's not getting much thought.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, we need to talk more about that. And so I know we're running a little. We're running a little long. So but I wanted to make sure that people had time to, like, if they wanted to sign books or anything like that.
Oh, absolutely.
But
Carrie, any
Carrie?
questions on that side?
Can I ask one more, because it's super relevant to what you're talking about right now? This is from Michael Birnbaum Quintero, who wishes you congratulations. It points out he's very excited to get your autograph on this book, and says, I want to ask something related to the fact that this event is hosted by African American Studies, and I'm interested in whether this book also provides a model for thinking through Latin studies. In a broad sense, how do you see this book as contributing to ethnic studies or race outside Asian American studies specifically? Or do we need to sit with and center Asian Americans specifically for a minute first?
So I think in a lot of ways, Lewis just kind of asked the appropriate sort of question that ties those things together. Yeah, I'm just thinking about like the way the Latinidad function discursively in this conversation. Yeah, it's hard for me to think about it with a level of authority here, but I do think that the framework that I'm trying to provide in the book can absolutely be mobilized across different contexts. Now, obviously, I focus on Asian American case studies, and that's where the concept is rooted. But I would not be offended if it ends up being used in non-Asian American context. Whether or not, and I consider myself, an ethnic studies stan, I suppose. But I guess in a lot of ways this book has sort of ended up being, well, actually, let me take that back. The book actually, in many respects, draws largely from Black feminism to develop its concepts. So it's not just an Asian American studies book. And yeah, I do talk a little bit about those. So there's an ethnic studies primordial soup underneath this book outside of Asian American studies. Thanks, Jana. Well, anyway, thank you so much, Carrie. And I know, Carrie, you're doing this under particularly challenging circumstances, and I hope your family's okay. And Louis, thank you for
Pleasure. Yeah.
And thank all of you for being here. This is fun.
We're gonna have Takeo sign books if you're interested, and give hugs.
Only if you're comfortable. I think Venmo's.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
Hikaru.
everyone online.
There's the baby, everyone.
Do you want to sit here?
Yeah, I guess I should. So I'm selling the book for 25 each, which is heavily discounted, or whatever it is, or whatever you. I'm not going to turn those down.
The hugs are free?
Hugs are free.
Yes, sir.
Hugs are free. So you can Venmo me here, or I have a limited amount of cash. I mean, a limited amount of small bills if you want to do that. But yeah, anyway, I guess I should probably shut up as soon as yeah. Okay. But anyway, thank you again, everybody, for coming. I guess I'll stop this now.
Congratulations. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.